dreams in pieces. The rain came down harder than Amelia Harper expected, sheets of silver pouring through the streets of New York City, blurring the glowing neon signs into watercolor streaks. Her umbrella had broken somewhere between the subway station and the gallery door, so she arrived soaked through, her auburn curls plastered to her cheeks. Inside, the gallery felt like a cathedral that no one wanted to worship in. Her canvases, 50 of them, hung in orderly lines along the stark white walls. Each piece represented weeks of sleepless nights, spilled emotions, and the kind of private battles she never dared to tell anyone about. And yet they hung there in silence, witnesses to her failure, because after 3 days of polite smiles, critical stares, and half-hearted compliments, not one of them had sold. Amelia stood in the center of the gallery, arms folded tightly around herself, as the last visitor drifted out with a faint, indifferent smile. The sound of the closing door echoed like a gavel announcing judgment. Her landlord's text message pinged in her pocket for the 5th time that evening, a reminder about overdue rent, and her chest ached as if the world were squeezing every ounce of hope from her ribs. The exhibition was supposed to be her breakthrough, the moment when her name would finally mean something beyond a little town in Nebraska. Instead, it felt like she had thrown her dreams into the river and watched them sink. She began taking her paintings down one by one, lowering them gently as though they were fragile children. Each canvas was more than color and brushstrokes. Each was a journal entry, a confession, a scream disguised as beauty. Now they were just heavy, lifeless boards she had to carry back to her cramped Brooklyn studio apartment. The thought of returning to that tiny place with its peeling paint and constant noise from the upstairs neighbors made her stomach twist. What was the point anymore? She had sacrificed everything, her savings, her friendships, even the comfort of home for this one chance, and she had failed spectacularly. For a moment she leaned her forehead against one of her larger canvases, the oil still faintly smelling of turpentine, and she whispered a shaky apology to herself. Her art teacher back in Cedar Falls had once told her she carried fire in her hands, that the world would someday need her vision, but right now all Amelia felt was smoke, choking her before the fire could ever catch. The gallery lights hummed overhead, almost mocking her with their sterile brightness, and she suddenly couldn't bear to stand there one more second. She needed air. She needed space. She needed to run. 2 hours later, her suitcase lay half-zipped on the studio floor, filled with clothes packed in blind haste. Her credit card balance screamed at her, but she ignored it as she booked the last seat on a red-eye flight to Denver. She had never been to Colorado. She had never even seen real mountains. But something about the name, the way it promised sharp peaks and clean air, called to her like a distant song. If her life was going to unravel, she wanted it to unravel somewhere that at least looked beautiful. By the time the plane landed, dawn was bleeding over the horizon, painting the Rockies in shades of pink and gold. Amelia's breath caught as she looked out the window. She had painted sunsets before, tried to capture light as it slipped across the world. But this was like watching the earth itself breathe. When she picked up her rental car, a dented compact that rattled when she turned the key, she didn't care. She drove for hours, winding higher and higher into the mountains past pine forests and streams swollen with spring melt. Every turn seemed to peel away another layer of New York's weight from her shoulders. By the time she saw the Cascade Mountain Lodge, nestled like a dream against the mountainside, she felt almost dizzy with relief. The lodge was something out of a fairy tale, stone and timber rising with a rugged grace, smoke curling from chimneys, windows glowing warmly against the morning chill. It was far beyond what her budget should allow, but Amelia didn't care anymore. If she was going to break, let her break in a place like this. The lobby swallowed her whole as she stepped inside. Massive stone fireplaces, leather chairs that looked older than her grandparents' farm, ceilings so high they seemed to reach into the clouds. The scent of pine and wood smoke filled the air, wrapping around her like a blanket she hadn't realized she was desperate for. Behind the desk, a woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes full of quiet kindness looked up. "Welcome to Cascade Mountain Lodge. I'm Grace Montenegro, the general manager. How can we help you today?" Amelia tried to smile but felt it tremble. "I need a room, just for as long as my card will let me." Grace studied her for a long moment, her expression softening as if she could see right through the brave mask to the cracks beneath. "We have a lovely suite overlooking the valley. she said gently. Lots of natural light. I think you'll like it. Amelia nodded, grateful beyond words, and followed the bellman up to a suite that seemed designed for someone else's life. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed an endless valley, sunlight spilling like gold coins across the peaks. A sitting area begged for an easel, a notebook, something creative, but Amelia was too exhausted to even unpack. She collapsed onto the bed, the crisp white sheets cool against her cheek, and slept without moving for nearly 14 hours. When she woke, it was to the sound of distant thunder. Clouds gathered outside, gray and heavy, curling around the mountaintops like restless spirits. Grace had mentioned spring storms could be sudden and fierce. Amelia watched the sky deepen as she dressed, her stomach finally demanding food. The restaurant was quiet when she arrived, nearly empty except for a few couples finishing late dinners. She chose a table by the wide windows, fascinated by the way lightning danced across the peaks, splitting the night into brief flashes of brilliance. Her soup arrived steaming, but Amelia barely touched it. Her mind wandered, swirling with the storm outside, with questions about what came next. She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't notice him. Across the dining room, seated alone with a glass of scotch, was a man who seemed both entirely out of place and perfectly at home. Jonathan Rivers. She didn't know his name yet, but even from across the room he radiated a gravity that pulled her eyes to him. His dark hair was slightly tousled, as though he had been running his hands through it all day. His jaw was strong, set in a line of controlled frustration. His sweater looked understated but expensive, the kind of fabric Amelia could never afford to touch. But it wasn't the clothes or the posture that caught her attention. It was his eyes, dark, shadowed, carrying something heavy and unspoken. For a fleeting moment their gazes met across the room, and Amelia felt something unfamiliar stir inside her. Recognition, perhaps. The recognition of another wounded soul. She looked away quickly, but her pulse had already changed its rhythm. Then the storm broke. Rain hammered the windows in wild fury, and thunder cracked so loudly the glass seemed to tremble in its frame. The lights flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the restaurant into a surreal amber glow as emergency lamps hummed to life. A murmur rippled through the room. Amelia stood, half drawn to the storm outside, half seeking steadiness in her own shaking breath. And then it happened. Another violent crash of thunder shook the floor, startling her so much that she stumbled back, her heel catching on the edge of the rug. She felt herself tipping, falling, and before she could cry out, strong arms wrapped around her, pulling her against a chest that smelled faintly of cedar and rain. Time seemed to freeze. Amelia looked up, breathless, into the very same dark eyes she had noticed moments before. They were closer now, filled with something fierce and protective, something she couldn't name. Her hands pressed against his chest instinctively, feeling the steady beat of his heart through the soft wool. His arms held her firmly, as though letting her fall was unthinkable. "You're safe," he said softly, his voice deep, rough-edged, and certain. And in that moment, with thunder raging outside and the lodge bathed in flickering light, Amelia Harper felt the ground of her broken life shift beneath her. She had fallen into the arms of a stranger, but his presence felt like the first promise she had heard in a long, long time. Two strangers, one storm. The dining room of the Cascade Mountain Lodge had fallen into an enchanted sort of stillness. The storm outside raged on, lightning tearing across the heavens with violent brilliance. Yet inside, the emergency lamps cast an amber glow that made everything seem softer, older, as if time had slowed down just for those who remained. The power outage had turned what could have been an inconvenience into something strangely intimate, a moment where strangers might dare to speak in ways they would never consider under the harsh lights of the ordinary world. Amelia, still held within the protective circle of Jonathan's arms, felt her heart pound in her chest with a rhythm that was both fear and wonder. She knew she should step back, release herself from the warmth of this stranger. Yet her body betrayed her, lingering against him as though some instinct whispered she was exactly where she needed to be. Jonathan's eyes searched hers with a steadiness that unsettled her. It was not the gaze of a man who sought casual flirtation or momentary comfort. There was something in those dark eyes. Pain, yes, but also an honesty, a rawness, that made her feel as though he could see straight through the layers of disappointment she had wrapped around herself since leaving New York. He lowered his head slightly, his voice almost lost against the rumble of the storm. Are you hurt? The question was simple, but it carried a weight that made Amelia's throat tighten. She shook her head. No. You caught me before I could fall. For a brief, suspended moment, neither moved. The world reduced to the fragile closeness of two strangers bound together by chance and thunder. Then reality intruded. Staff members appeared with flashlights. Murmurs filled the room. And Grace, Montenegro's calm voice carried across the dining hall, assuring guests that backup generators would keep the essentials running, though full power might take hours to restore. She invited everyone to gather in the lobby lounge, where candles, lanterns, and refreshments would be provided until the storm passed. Slowly, reluctantly, Jonathan eased his arms from around Amelia, and she stepped back, her skin tingling from the absence of his warmth. Yet as they both turned toward the lobby, it was as if an invisible thread still connected them, pulling them forward side by side. The lobby had transformed into something out of a storybook. The massive stone fireplace roared with fresh logs, casting flickering light across carved beams and polished wood floors. Staff moved gracefully among the guests, offering wine, tea, and small platters of bread and fruit. Children sat cross-legged on rugs, wide-eyed as one of the bellmen began telling ghost stories by lantern glow. Couples settled into deep leather chairs, their voices lowered as though the storm demanded reverence. And there, near the hearth, Amelia and Jonathan found themselves guided by unspoken agreement, settling into two armchairs angled toward one another, the fire painting their faces with warmth. Jonathan lifted his glass of scotch, offering it in a silent toast before speaking. "I'm Jonathan," he said simply, his voice steady but quieter than before, as though the storm demanded honesty but not volume. "Amelia," she replied, cradling the glass of wine a server had placed in her hand. For a moment she considered, stopping there, letting the silence grow, but the firelight made it easier to breathe, easier to confess. "I'm here alone." He studied her with quiet attentiveness. "So am I." It should have ended there. Two strangers acknowledging their solitude in passing. Yet the storm and the fire conspired to make it impossible to retreat into silence. The words spilled more easily than Amelia expected, surprising even her. "I'm running away from a failure," she said softly, eyes fixed on the flames. "A spectacular one." Jonathan's expression shifted. Not curiosity, not judgment, but recognition. He leaned slightly forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "What kind of failure?" "The kind where you pour everything into something, every ounce of yourself, and the world tells you it's not good enough." She took a sip of wine, letting it warm her throat, then continued before she could stop herself. "I'm an artist. At least I thought I was. I had my first solo exhibition in New York this week. I thought it would change my life. Instead, it showed me I might not have one to change." The admission left her both lighter and raw, as though she had peeled back a bandage before the wound had closed. She waited for polite sympathy, perhaps the kind that people offered when they had no idea how to respond. But Jonathan did not offer platitudes. His jaw tightened, and his gaze dropped briefly to the floor before he lifted it back to hers. "The world doesn't always recognize beauty when it's right in front of them," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "Sometimes they're blind. Sometimes they're afraid of what they don't understand." Amelia blinked, caught off guard. "You sound like you know something about that." A humorless smile touched his lips. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass before answering. "I built something once, something I thought mattered. Started with nothing but an idea, a few lines of code, and a lot of sleepless nights. It grew into a company, a big one. People called it an empire. And then..." He paused, his throat tightening as though the words were ash he had to force out. "Then someone I trusted most tried to take it from me. My partner, my best friend. Betrayal doesn't come cheap." Silence stretched between them, not heavy but profound. Outside, the storm crashed on, rain drumming the roof like a heartbeat. Amelia set her glass down on the low table between them, her fingers brushing against the polished wood. "I don't know which is worse," she murmured. "The world ignoring you, or the people you love betraying you?" Jonathan looked at her then, really looked, and something inside his chest shifted. He had come here to escape, to bury himself in solitude until the storm inside him dulled. Yet here was a woman whose vulnerability mirrored his own, whose voice carried the weight of dreams broken and the courage to admit it aloud. He felt a pull he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, a pull toward connection, toward understanding. They talked as the storm raged, their words weaving a fragile bridge between two wounded hearts. Amelia told him about Cedar Falls, about the teacher who had encouraged her when no one else did, about the way she had saved pennies for years to afford paints and brushes. She spoke of the exhilaration of creating something from nothing, and the crushing silence when no one cared enough to notice. Jonathan listened, not the distracted listening of someone waiting to speak, but the kind that absorbed every syllable, the kind that made her feel seen. In turn, he spoke of the empire he had built, not with pride but with the wistful tone of a man remembering why he had once cared. He admitted that somewhere along the way, creation had given way to competition, and innovation had been smothered by profit. And when his partner had tried to seize control, it wasn't just the betrayal that broke him. It was the realization that he no longer recognized what he had built. Amelia's eyes softened as she listened, and when he faltered, she did not pity him. She simply nodded as if to say, "I understand." Hours slipped by unnoticed. Wine glasses were refilled, the fire burned low and then was stoked again, and still they sat. Two strangers speaking as though they had known each other all their lives. Around them the lobby quieted. Children fell asleep in their parents' laps. Couples drifted upstairs. Staff moved silently like caretakers of a dream. Eventually, Grace appeared once more, her silver hair gleaming in the lantern light, announcing that the power had been restored throughout the valley. Guests stirred, gathering their belongings, murmuring about the storm. The spell began to fray. Amelia felt a pang of disappointment sharper than she expected. She had not wanted the night to end. She glanced at Jonathan, who seemed equally reluctant to rise. For a moment they sat in silence, both aware that the fragile magic might dissolve with the return of electricity, both unsure how to hold on to it. Then Jonathan stood abruptly, turning to face her. "Amelia," he said, his voice careful but resolute, "I know we just met. I know this storm feels like it's suspended us outside of the real world, but I haven't felt this connected in longer than I can remember. Would you?" He hesitated, a rare uncertainty flickering across his features. "Would you have breakfast with me tomorrow?" Her answer was out before she could stop it, her heart speaking faster than her mind. "Yes, I'd like that very much." Relief softened his expression, and for the first time that night, a genuine smile broke across his face, transforming him from the brooding stranger at the corner table into a man who looked startlingly young, startlingly alive. "Good," he said simply, "because I have a feeling tomorrow is the beginning of something extraordinary." As they walked together toward the elevator, their steps slow, unhurried, Amelia felt something stir inside her chest that she had thought long dead. Hope. She carried it with her as the elevator doors closed, a fragile ember glowing against the darkness. And though the storm outside was already fading, she knew it had left behind something more than broken branches and flooded roads. It had left her with a promise, one she wasn't sure she believed yet, but one she desperately wanted to. Breaking the walls. The morning after the storm, the hotel seemed to breathe differently, as though the night's chaos had peeled away some invisible layer of pretense and left behind only raw, unpolished truth. The golden sunlight spilled across the mountain ridges, melting the frost on the pine needles, and inside the hotel lobby, the world felt hushed with a kind of reverence, as though something important was unfolding in its walls. Amelia woke earlier than usual, her mind restless, her heart still replaying the way Jonathan had whispered to her in the dark. "I'll never let go." Those words had clung to her more stubbornly than the storm winds against the glass. They had burrowed beneath her doubts, stirring a warmth she hadn't felt in years, a warmth both terrifying and intoxicating. She was still in yesterday's jeans and sweater when she wandered toward the breakfast lounge. her sketchbook tucked under her arm like a shield. Jonathan was already there, seated near the wide glass windows that overlooked the valley below. He was not dressed like the man she had imagined him to be when she first saw him. No sharp business suit, no polished shoes, no commanding presence of a billionaire who ruled boardrooms. Instead, he wore a simple shirt rolled at the sleeves, his hair still tousled, his eyes shadowed by thoughts too heavy for any ordinary morning. He didn't see her at first. His gaze was fixed on the mist drifting through the mountains, his expression torn between longing and grief. Amelia hesitated, unsure if she was intruding, but something about the vulnerability in his posture pulled her closer. When he finally looked up and saw her, his face softened instantly, and for the first time since their accidental meeting, she saw not a stranger, not a man running from betrayal, but a human soul aching for connection. Breakfast arrived with the quiet clatter of silver trays, coffee steaming, fruit fresh, bread still warm. They sat across from each other, speaking in pauses more than in sentences. It wasn't the silence of indifference, but of unspoken truths pressing against the walls they had built inside themselves. Amelia finally broke it by flipping open her sketchbook and sliding it across the table. "I drew this last night," she said softly, almost embarrassed. Jonathan leaned forward, studying the lines. It was the storm, chaotic and wild, but within its center was a figure, steady, unshaken, a silhouette holding on against the winds. "That's you," she admitted before she could take the words back. Her cheeks flushed with heat, and she instantly regretted revealing so much. But Jonathan didn't laugh or dismiss her. He only stared at the drawing for a long moment, his throat working as though something inside him had cracked open. "I've been called many things," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "But never an anchor. Never someone who stands firm. I've been told I build, I fight, I win, but no one's ever drawn me as this." He touched the sketch carefully, as though it were something sacred. For a moment, Amelia wondered if she had given him more than just a picture. She had given him back a part of himself that had been buried under betrayal and loss. The hours that followed unfolded with a strange ease, as though the walls they had carried for years were slowly dissolving. Jonathan told her about the empire he had built, not in pride but in exhaustion, describing the weight of responsibility, the people he had trusted who turned against him, and the emptiness of rooms filled with wealth but no laughter. Amelia in turn shared her own shattered path, the rejection letters, the gallery owner who had told her she lacked marketable talent, the humiliating silence of people walking past her paintings as though they were invisible. "Sometimes," she confessed, staring at her coffee, "I feel like the world doesn't just ignore me, it erases me." Jonathan's hand tightened around his cup, his jaw flexing. "Then the world is blind," he said firmly, his tone carrying the steel of a man who was used to bending reality to his will. "Because what I see in your art and in you is impossible to erase." His words struck her like a spark in dry tinder, igniting something inside her chest that had almost died out. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not for what she had failed to achieve, but for who she truly was beneath the failures. Later that afternoon, they walked into the small mountain town together, the street still damp from the storm, lined with quaint shops and colorful awnings. Amelia carried her sketchbook. Jonathan kept his hands in his pockets, but the distance between them narrowed with every step. They stopped at a local art store, where Amelia's eyes lit up at the sight of paints and brushes, though her shoulders slumped quickly when she checked her wallet. Jonathan noticed, but he didn't step in with his wealth or try to rescue her. Instead, he quietly picked up a brush, handed it to her, and said, "You should never stop creating, even if it's with one brush and one color." It wasn't pity, it was respect. And in that moment, Amelia realized he wasn't treating her as someone broken who needed saving. He was treating her as someone worth believing in. That night, back at the hotel, Amelia painted again for the first time in weeks. Jonathan sat nearby, pretending to read a book, but his eyes kept drifting to her as she worked, her brows furrowed, her lips pressed together, her hands alive with color. The canvas bloomed with mountains under dawn light, wild and unrestrained. But at the heart of it was a small figure looking toward the horizon. Jonathan realized with a sudden ache that the figure was him, and that Amelia had placed him not in the shadows of loss, but in the promise of a sunrise. It left him shaken, because for the first time in years he didn't feel like a man running from the past. He felt like a man stepping toward a future, Yet even as their bond deepened, fear whispered between them like an unseen shadow. Amelia caught herself wondering what it would mean to trust someone again, especially a man who had the power to crush her world if he chose. Jonathan, on the other hand, wrestled with the risk of opening his heart, knowing how betrayal felt when it came from someone he once loved. But as he watched Amelia paint, as he listened to her laugh softly at her own mistakes, as he saw the stubborn fire in her eyes that refused to be extinguished, he began to think that perhaps some walls were meant to be broken, not for weakness, but for the possibility of something greater than either of them had ever known. And so part 3 ended with both of them standing at the edge of their fears, daring to believe that maybe, just maybe, what had begun in the chaos of a storm could grow into something strong enough to change the course of their lives. The test of trust, the days following the storm, became a rhythm neither Jonathan nor Amelia had expected to find. Their mornings began with quiet breakfast by the glass windows. Their afternoons were spent walking through the mountain trails or sitting in silence while Amelia painted, and their evenings ended with conversations that dug into the marrow of who they truly were. For the first time in years, Jonathan wasn't consumed by boardroom battles or legal contracts, and Amelia wasn't haunted by the echoes of failure. It felt like they had stepped into a hidden pocket of the world where pain could be set aside and possibility could breathe. Yet beneath the warmth, beneath the laughter and easy companionship, there lingered a fragile awareness. Reality had not vanished, only waited just outside the hotel walls. That reality arrived one crisp morning when Jonathan's assistant, Daniel, appeared at the hotel unannounced. He came dressed sharply, his polished shoes out of place on the worn wooden floors, his briefcase snapping open like a declaration of war against the fragile peace Jonathan had built here. Amelia, who had gone to fetch more paints from town, returned to the sight of Daniel speaking in low, urgent tones at the corner of the lobby, his voice edged with desperation. Jonathan's face was tight, his hands clenched against the arm of his chair, the mask of a powerful man slipping back over his features. The sight of it made Amelia pause by the doorway, her heart caught in her throat. Daniel did not notice her, but she could hear fragments of the conversation. "You've disappeared for weeks, Jonathan. The board is restless. Investors are panicking. The betrayal you uncovered has left cracks everywhere, and if you don't come back to repair them, you won't have a company to return to." His words were like a hammer pounding against the sanctuary Jonathan had carved for himself in the mountains. For a moment, Jonathan's eyes flicked toward Amelia, and in that glance she saw the war tearing inside him. He wanted to stay, to hold on to this fragile bond that had become the only place he felt alive again. But he was also a man bound to responsibilities that refused to let him go. Amelia felt her chest tighten as the thought bloomed in her mind. What if I'm nothing more than a distraction? What if this bond they had built was not destiny, but simply an interlude in a man's life before he returned to his empire and left her behind like all the others? The doubt stung with a familiar cruelty. The same voice that had whispered when gallery owners ignored her, when friends stopped calling, when love had once left her stranded. She turned away before Jonathan could rise from his chair, before he could explain, because in that moment, she wasn't sure she could bear to hear the truth. That night, she didn't paint. She sat in her room with the lights off, staring at her blank canvas, her heart heavy with the weight of distrust. When Jonathan knocked softly on her door, his voice low, asking if she wanted to talk, she whispered through the wood that she was tired. He didn't press, but she could hear the frustration in his footsteps as he walked away. The silence between them stretched like a chasm, wide and dangerous, threatening to swallow everything they had built. The following morning, Jonathan sought her out on the terrace overlooking the valley. He looked worn, as though the war inside him had only deepened overnight. "Amelia," he said quietly, his voice stripped of the smooth confidence he wore in public. "I need you to know something. Daniel came here to pull me back into that world, but I didn't run here just to hide from business. I came because I was drowning. I came because I had lost faith in everyone around me. And then I met you." His gaze held hers, unwavering, fierce in its honesty. "You are not a distraction. You're the only reason I believe I can go back and fight it all." Her throat tightened, but doubt still clung stubbornly. "How do I know that's not just words, Jonathan?" "People have promised me forever before, and forever has always ended." Her voice cracked at the edges, betraying the rawness she usually kept hidden. How do I know you won't walk away once the storm of your life calms down? Jonathan stepped closer, his presence steady, unyielding. Because I don't want calm, he said firmly. I don't want a life that looks perfect but feels hollow. I want something real, even if it's messy, even if it scares me.
And you, Amelia?
You're the most real thing I've ever found. His words were not polished or rehearsed. They were jagged with sincerity, and that sincerity unsettled her as much as it moved her. Still, the fear did not dissolve instantly. It pressed against her like a wall she had lived behind for too long. But as the sun broke through the mountain mist, casting light across his face, she felt something shift. He was offering her not a promise of perfection, but a choice. A chance to believe that trust was not always betrayal, waiting in disguise. She didn't answer him that morning. Instead, she walked away, her heart torn between hope and caution, her mind replaying his words. The test of trust had begun, and neither of them knew how it would end. But as Jonathan watched her leave, he whispered to himself the same vow he had spoken when he caught her in the storm. I'll never let go. And though Amelia couldn't yet bring herself to believe it, the truth was already taking root in her heart, growing, trembling, waiting for the moment when she would have to decide whether to run from it or hold on with everything she had. The leap of faith. The storm that had brought them together was long gone. Yet both Amelia and Jonathan now faced a different kind of tempest, one born not from thunder and lightning, but from the weight of choices that could change their lives forever. Jonathan had returned to his suite after his conversation with Amelia on the terrace, his mind restless with memories of her words. Her doubts cut him more deeply than the betrayal of his partner, because for once he wasn't fighting to save a company, he was fighting to prove himself worthy of someone's fragile trust. That battle was infinitely more terrifying. For the first time, he could not rely on contracts, strategies, or wealth. He could only rely on the truth of his heart. 2 days later, Amelia woke to find an envelope slipped under her door. It was heavy, embossed with Jonathan's initials, but inside there was no letter of romance or apology, only an invitation. The note read simply, "Tonight in the Grand Hall. Come if you believe in beginnings." The simplicity of the words unnerved her. She paced her room, staring at the canvas that had remained blank since Daniel's visit. She wanted to go, but fear coiled tightly inside her. To step into that hall would mean acknowledging that what she felt for him was not just a passing connection born of circumstance, but something real. Something that could either heal her or shatter her completely. That evening, as dusk settled over the mountains, the grand hall of Cascade Lodge glowed with golden light. Amelia hesitated at the doorway, her dress plain but graceful, her auburn curls tumbling freely around her shoulders. She almost turned back, but then she heard Jonathan's voice carrying through the hall, not soft and intimate as it had been with her, but strong, commanding, the voice of a man who was standing before others and laying bare his soul. Inside, a small gathering had assembled. Investors, board members, Daniel and Grace stood among the shadows, clearly brought here by Jonathan's design. At the center stood Jonathan himself, tall and resolute, his dark eyes burning with conviction. Amelia froze, her heart pounding as she realized what this was. Not a meeting of business, but a reckoning. Jonathan's voice filled the hall. 3 weeks ago I disappeared. Not because I was weak, not because I was running from my responsibility, but because I had been betrayed by someone I trusted with everything I had built. And in that betrayal, I lost something more important than money. I lost my faith in people. I came here to hide, to escape, but instead I found something I hadn't expected. His eyes searched the room until they found her at the back, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. I found the truth that strength is not in isolation, but in connection. I found that trust can be broken and still rebuilt. And I found her. The room seemed to disappear around Amelia as every head turned toward her. She felt her cheeks flush, her instincts screaming at her to run. But Jonathan's eyes anchored her in place. His voice softened yet carried to every corner of the hall. Amelia Rose Harper taught me that failure does not define us, and that vulnerability is not weakness but the greatest form of courage. She reminded me why I wanted to create, not for power or profit, but for beauty, for meaning. Tonight I choose to build again, not just a company, but a life. And I will not build it without her. A stunned silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace. Amelia's heart hammered so violently she thought it might shatter her chest. This man, this guarded, wounded man who had the world at his fingertips, was standing before everyone who had once demanded his perfection and laying his truth bare, not for business, but for her. Tears burned her eyes as she stepped forward, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. When she reached him, she searched his face for doubt, for the polished charm of someone performing, but all she saw was raw, unshaken sincerity. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but it carried with the weight of all the battles she had fought alone. Jonathan, all my life I've been told I wasn't enough, that my dreams were too fragile, my heart too foolish. I believed it until you caught me in that storm. You held me like I was worth something, and you've been holding me ever since, even when I tried to push you away. She took a breath, steadying herself as the tears slipped down her cheeks. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. I don't know if I'll ever stop being afraid. But I do know one thing. I don't want to face any of it without you. The room seemed to exhale as Jonathan closed the space between them and took her hands in his. Then don't, he whispered, his voice low enough for only her. Don't let go. Not now, not ever. And in that moment, Amelia chose. She chose to believe, to trust, to let herself fall not into despair but into love. She rose onto her toes, and when their lips met, the hall erupted. Not with applause, not with polite acknowledgement, but with a silence so profound it felt like the world itself was pausing to bear witness. Grace, standing near the back, smiled knowingly, while Daniel wiped his eyes, though he would never admit it. The investors who had come to demand Jonathan's return left with a new understanding, not of business, but of the man who led them. From that day forward, the Cascade Lodge no longer held just the memory of a storm that had knocked out the power. It became the place where two broken souls found the courage to begin again. Amelia's paintings, once dismissed, would soon capture the raw beauty of the mountains and the fire of her new hope. Jonathan, armed not with strategy but with love, returned to his empire not as a man running from betrayal, but as one standing firmly in the truth of who he was. Together they learned that storms don't only destroy, they also clear the air, making space for something new to grow. And so, the woman who had fallen into his arms in the chaos of thunder and lightning became the anchor of his life. And the man who whispered he'd never let go kept that promise, not through words but through every act of love, every step they took together into the unknown. Their story was not one of perfect endings, but of brave beginnings, and in that courage they discovered the kind of love that storms cannot break.